Nicky is a great advocate for having a go at composting because he's been doing it for years. Not only doing it, he's also been teaching composting in schools. He's a consultant advising councils and businesses on composting and waste reduction. He is responsible for persuading countless people to value their food waste. And that alone has saved tons of methane because less food ends up in landfill. He's the author of Reduce, Reuse, Recycle, and his new book makes composting easy. It'll save you money and maybe help you grow lovely plants. There's not much that Nicky doesn't know about composting, and here he is to tell you about the book.
Thank you very much. Okay, so how to make and use compost. So can you pick the vital ingredients you must have in this list to make compost? This is something I bang on about all the time with composting. It's very, very simple to make compost. All you need are two ingredients, air and water. But of course, the air ingredients are in the form of tough stuff that allows airflow, usually called browns by most composting people, carbon or browns, and water in the form of the green stuff, the nitrogen. So it's carbon and nitrogen really, but that's in the form of tough stuff that allows the air through or contains a lot of air, or soft stuff that obviously contains lots of water. And I will bang on more about that in a minute. What can you not compost on this list? Answer, you can compost them all. Bit of a trick question this, because some plastic is genuinely compostable plastic and others need special treatment. So yes, you can't compost most plastics, but you can compost proper compostable plastics. So it's a big thing this. I mean, compostable plastics are coming in more and more, and they actually wreak havoc with the recycling collections because they do compost. But you have to be very careful. The definition of biodegradable plastic and degradable plastic is actually, there's no difference between the two really, because they both break down in the environment with the action of oxygen and sunlight, UV light particularly. So they just break down into smaller microplastics. However, some biodegradable plastics are made from plant material. So it's a bit of a minefield to get when you start drilling down into it. And there are some experiments going on. You can follow those links, which will be available afterwards. And there are experiments going on, which I've taken part of actually, putting plastics into my compost and seeing and attaching tags to them and seeing how they come back. They've actually been coming back with some of the results, but I haven't dug my compost out yet to see how they're getting on. I've got some hemp compost. So you've got to look for the symbols on your plastic there, those kind of symbols where it says compostable with a leaf or a flower. There are various ones. Some of them only break down in big industrial composters, but I've found that they'll go right through my composting system. I'll put them out on my allotment or garden and I'll see bits of plastic around, but they will break down in the sunlight when they get out exposed to the air and light, and they do disappear, which is actually the same as what happens with avocado skins, I find. So people say you can't compost avocado skins, but they will break down once they're out and on the ground. So how long does it take to make compost? 2 weeks, 2 months, 6 months, 1 year, or something else? What do you think? It does depend. So quite a lot of compost machine makers like the rocket composters, who say accelerated compost, you can make compost in 2 weeks. I've taken issue with them on that. You can accelerate the first phase of composting where everything's very active by turning it and regularly, or having it in a machine that turns it on a regular basis. But all that does is take it to a point where it won't reheat in as little as 2 weeks. But then the maturation phase takes, where the worms in particular take over, can take 6 to 12 months. Sort of depends on the time of year and the weather conditions as well. But some materials, if you do them separately, like autumn leaves, can take 2 or even 3 years to fully break down. And if you go to Kew Gardens, you'll see huge, great containers full of leaves for making leaf mold, which is really a kind of specialized form of rotting down using fungi. So it really does depend on various factors. This is how I designed the systems for schools, really, by taking that into account, using a first phase composter and then a slower maturation bit. Okay, and this is the final poll. So what life will you find in your compost heap? You know, animals, plants, fungi, bacteria, or all of the above? All of the above. In fact, all the kingdoms of life can be found in the compost heap. And I'll come back to a little bit at the end. So I told you I'd say this, bang on about this. The vital ingredients you must have in your compost are air and water. And this is the most crucial thing to remember all the time, because it contains all the kingdoms of life, all of those invertebrates, animals, plants, fungi, bacteria, and so on. They all need air and water, basically. Composting is an aerobic system. It needs air, but all the materials in there need a film of water around it. So you must have both of those in equal parts. So how do you know? You can do a squeeze test. So you can dig a bit into your compost, grab a handful and squeeze it. This is particularly useful if you've had a very active hot compost with lots of water vapor pouring off it. It can actually dry out too much. If you haven't got a good lid and you're not condensing the water, you can dry it out, and then you end up with a sort of very musty, dusty compost. And if you start digging into your compost when it's musty and dusty, you've got to stop, because that can be full of Aspergillus fumigatus, which can cause farmer's lung. You can breathe in all those fungal spores and they can lodge in your lungs, and it's a kind of chronic condition that's very, very difficult to get rid of. So if you do get that too dry, then you must soak your compost heap down, saturate it thoroughly, and let it drain through, and just leave it alone and for a few months. That's what I do if that ever happens. It's particularly common on big sort of community composting piles. And you can compost everything on that list, the list that we had near the beginning, but as quite a few of you ticked off cat poo and dog poo and things like that, and meat and fish and dairy produce and all the rest of it, and cooked food, these things have to be dealt with very carefully because of the obvious reasons of smelling, attracting rats and flies and all the rest of it. So there are various compost makers, not the one in the drawing, that's just made up by Bob Gale, who did the drawings. But there are quite a few solutions to that. Probably the easiest one to do is to use the bakashi bins, which are in that picture there on the right. They're basically two nesting buckets. The top bucket has some holes drilled in the bottom to let liquid go into the bottom. Or as you can see on the display board on the left, you can see it's very small, of course, on the screen, but you can buy these fancy bakashi bins, which have a tap on them as well. And you have to buy the fermentation material. Now, this is a bit of a cheat because it's actually, I said everything needs air, but actually in the bakashi system is an airless system. It's actually an anaerobic system that's without air, and it ferments in much the same way that you make sauerkraut or kimchi, fermented foods. It's the same kind of idea, but it's for your kitchen waste. The great thing about it, though, is when it's been used a lot in urban situations where rats and flies and Solomon ants and cockroaches and all sorts of things are a problem. And it does deal with that very, very well. So once you've bakashied it, you'll have two sets of those buckets, and you leave it for a couple of weeks. You can then either dig a hole in the garden and just bury it, or add it to another compost system. Or you can use some other ones there, the green cone or the tumbler. And I go into, obviously in the book, I go into that in a lot more detail. It's something I made a bit of a specialist study of, working with schools and that kind of thing. And again, I'll come back to that in a moment. So how long does it take? Well, the leaf mold on the left there, as I said before, that can take 2 or 3 years. And it's just a simple way. You just have to fill up some bags with leaves. And as long as they're damp and covered up and left somewhere they'll gradually break down, or you can contain them. If you've got more amounts, you can contain them in some sort of wire container or something like that. If you've got working in a school and you've got one of these insulated tumbling bins like on the right there, you can get it heating up and composting down in a couple of weeks. Most of the ones that we've used with schools have been these Rye Downs, which are suitable for bigger schools. Well, most schools really, to be honest, because they come in a couple of different sizes, 3 different sizes actually, and they can take a large amount of food waste, and you mix it with pelletized sawdust usually, or wood chip, and turn the handle, and you get something out the other end in a couple of weeks that then needs to be matured. So you then put it into a maturation bin of some sort for the worms to get at it. And at that point, you can check it for moisture, do the squeeze test, add more water, check it's all right, and just let it quietly rot away, compost down. There's the Scotty Hotbox on the left there that we designed to go with schools, particularly for that purpose. So it will take 6 to 12 months from that point generally. Although if you're running a no-dig garden, you can use it sooner than that because you're not digging it in. So just to end up with, before we have some open up for questions, I've just got a few pictures of the kingdoms of life, the life that you've got in your compost. So we've got that's actually a piece of biochar with bacteria on it. So that's an electron microscope photograph of a tiny bit of charcoal, and it has a huge surface area for the bacteria to be on. And on the right there, you've got fungi, and the fungi in the soil can extract minerals from rock, and there's a whole symbiosis with plants, feeding the minerals to the plants, and the plants feed the fungi with the carbohydrates sugars basically, that they extract from photosynthesis. It's fascinating. We don't know, we're still finding out stuff about what's going on in the soil. Those are fungi lassoing nematode worms. Quite incredible how they do that. And on the right, there's some more bacteria. We've got protozoa. But of course, what you'll normally see are the big things like the beetles and the worms. And down the bottom, one of my favorites is the Springtails. So those little creatures, which are 1, 2, the very biggest, maybe 3 millimeters. And they're found on every continent on the planet, including Antarctica. Because my wife's uncle has studied them in Antarctica. He's a columbola specialist. Those little things can jump a meter in the air. And when you think they're only 1 millimeter or 2 millimeters long, that's quite remarkable. They have a long spring, about 2/3 of their body, that enables them to do that. So there's a little drawing from the book, which is showing that just in the top few inches of healthy topsoil, you've got, on a square meter, you've got enough life to support a single vertebrate, basically, whether that be a song thrush or a slow worm or a hedgehog, whatever it might be. The amount of life that's packed in is quite remarkable. And that's not a meter down, that's just in the top few inches of a good healthy soil. This is why the soils, it's so important to look after our soils, because we are losing billions of tons of them all the time. They're just flowing out into rivers and into the sea. So the compost, I think of it like alchemy, like the old alchemists. They combined air and water, in our case in the form of tough woody stuff like wood chips, and soft stappy stuff like grass cuttings. The air and the water, that creates a bacterial fire, and the bacteria can double every hour. So it's quite a fun thing to do with kids at schools on their calculators. You double over 24 hours. 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8, 8 becomes 16. If you keep doing that 24 times, you get up into the over 8 million. So that's it's all that life, explosion of life. As long as the air water mixture is right, that will keep happening. And then of course at the end of it, you end up over time with something that It's remarkably like soil, but it's actually compost. Compost and soil are analogous. The soil has got the mineral fraction in and the compost doesn't. And that's it. So you'll find out lots more in the book, of course, how to make it, why you're making it, what's going on. I've tried to put it all into the book. There we are. So over to you for questions. Lasagna compost is great, isn't it? Lasagna is not really, it's not really a composting. I suppose it is a type of composting. It's combining composting and growing at the same time. And it's a technique that I use all the time, actually, and especially great with schools, because when we've gone in to help schools with their gardens, we quite often find that they're thinking, they start thinking about growing a garden usually in the spring, usually in about March, and they should have been thinking of it back in September, of course, getting it prepared. That would have been much more sensible. So, but we've done this a lot. So all you have to do is cut down the top growth that you've got on a bit of ground. If you've got, you know, a weedy bit of growth, you can just scythe it down. That's what I do, or go in with a rough cut mower, and then you can cover it with cardboard. So sheets of cardboard, brilliant. If you go to IKEA, get the big stuff is good. And then what I do is cover the cardboard with newspaper and water it. And it's good if you have two people doing that, because it's inevitably windy when you ever do this, or you find out how much wind there is around, and newspaper blows around like mad. So you water it down to cover all the cracks in the cardboard, and then you layer. So that's the name, lasagna is layers, isn't it? Layers of pasta with different sauces on top. So you're layering different materials. So you can use any organic materials for that, really. I use a lot of wood chip. I've just been doing today. I've actually been lasagnaing the paths on my allotment. I've got a load of old thatching straw, and I've been covering that with wood chippings. But I've also done it on some of the beds, and then the way that you garden will depend on the materials that you've got. But yeah, you can layer fresh grass cuttings, compost, of course, manures, any bulky organic matter you can put in on layers. And a great way if you're starting from scratch is to use some really, well, one of the best easiest ones to do is to grow potatoes like that. So, you know, come Easter, you can plant your potatoes in that, because they're really tough and they'll go through lots of layers. Or if you're doing it later in the year, you can put little plants of squashes out, for instance, into it, that kind of thing. You can't really use it. Well, I suppose you could cut a drill in it and put some nice compost and put some seeds in it, but it's really for planting out plants into that you've grown in your own compost, hopefully. Well, that's a great question. You know, there was a 3-day conference on this by the Composting Association. When do you know that compost is compost? And apparently, I wasn't at it, but apparently at the summing up at the end, they said, if it looks like compost, feels like compost, and smells like compost, it's probably ready. It's probably compost. So you just get a feel. The best thing to do, people often say to me, well, my compost doesn't really look like yours, doesn't look like the stuff you get in bags, you know, it's lumpy and bumpy and it's got sticks and all sorts in it. So just dig a bit out, sieve a little bit into a wheelbarrow, get a garden sieve and just sieve a little bit into a wheelbarrow, and you'll be amazed how it transforms it, a little bit of sieving. And if you're still not sure if it's ready, pop a little bit into a plastic bag and fold it up, leave it for a couple of days, and then open up the bag and sniff it. If it stinks horrible, then it's not ready. If it still smells nice, then it's ready. That's an easy test. No, mold is just fungi. You know, you might not have the mold is probably growing on bits of peel and stuff like that you've got in the compost. It's growing on the sort of probably the more, you know, that kind of kitchen material. But of course, mold will also grow on woody stuff. It's a perfectly normal, natural thing to have there. Yeah, it depends what you're doing, really. For instance, I helped with a project in Hackney many years ago, the Nightingale estate, which is a high-rise estate in Hackney with a lot of problems with, it was a kind of no-go area, actually, with a lot of drug use and things. There was a guy there who was part of the community composting network who ran a little community centre at the bottom, played a lot of reggae music, and got very friendly with the people there. When the council, the estate was very overrun with rats and flies, and the chutes going down to the paladins, there's a great big bins that catch all the waste from the high-rise blocks. People were chucking down their cardboard boxes and things and blocking the chutes, and then the food waste was piling up, the rats were climbing up, the cockroaches were getting, it was really awful. The council tried to go in and tell them to stop doing it, but they kind of got run off the estate. So Cam at the community centre asked us and the community composting network what to do, and we suggested giving everyone bakashi bins. So every resident in the blocks of flat got bakashi bins for their food waste, and at the same time they also told them that they would collect their cardboard. So that freed up the chutes. So they collected up the cardboard, they collected up the bins with the bakashi. The bakashi stopped the smell that attracted the rats. And basically they cleared the estate of rats, and then they took it down and they put it into a rocket composter, which is like a mechanized Rye Downs, the one you saw in the picture. And they composted it and then put the resulting compost into various wormeries and had a little community garden down there. So that worked very, very well. And they started rolling that out in other parts of Hackney. And that was a very successful project. So if you're collecting food waste, yes, on a community scale, it's a very good idea to do something like that. But it does depend on what your, there are other factors involved. So I'm very happy for people who've got questions like that want to follow them up to write to me and help have more help from on the community sector side particularly. Yeah, well, that's because it's not true. There are lots of things like that. That's why I had that list. Citrus was on there, rhubarb leaves, all these things that people have been told that you cannot compost. There is some truth in it. I mean, if you're a mad juicer and you've got masses, or you go to a juice bar and pick up all the citrus peels and everything, if you think about it, citrus is full of the oils. So they've got oils on them. If you don't buy organic citrus, it's quite often dipped in paraffin wax to make it shiny and to, keep it looking fresh. Or if you're not buying organic, also they will have been sprayed with pesticides. So that's also going to inhibit the composting process. So there is some truth in that. But basically, citrus, everything will compost. Everything that once lived recently is going to compost. Otherwise, the world would be covered in citrus peel and rhubarb leaves and all these things, wouldn't it? So it will work. You can use citrus if you cut oranges and lemons in half and you're taking the juice out. They actually make very good slug traps as well. So that's another thing you can do with them. And I've done that quite a lot. And you put them down in the garden and the slugs will go underneath them, and you can kind of wash the slugs out in a bucket of water and leave them there. But I also have the advantage of stripping off all the kind of waxy parts of the citrus, and they compost a lot more readily then as well. Another thing you can do with citrus, of course, we do here quite a lot, is dry it out on our wood burner, and then they make great fire lighters as well. So there's lots of things you can do, but they will compost as well. Yes. I mean, when we do these food waste composting systems for schools, we actually usually supply them with pelletized sawdust to mix with their food waste. So that's the easiest things for schools to handle. And you only, because they swell up such a lot when they hit the water, any moisture, they really swell up. So you only need a sixth of a bucket to a whole bucket of food waste if you're using pelletized sawdust. So it's quite good from that point of view. Yeah. Well, I'm actually, I'm a no-dig gardener. So I don't turn my soil at all. And I've realized that I'm also a no-dig composter. I make my compost heaps very carefully. I do, when I'm running workshops, I do a workshop which I call the Mindfulness of Composting. And what I get the participants to do is to collect things around the garden, around the site, and lay them out on a long table, and sort of gradate them between air and water. So the toughest materials at one end, sort of little twigs or wood chips at one end, and down the other end, you've got your soft, sappy weeds and things at the other end. Now, if you're building your compost heap, you need to be very mindful. Every kind of bucket full or forkful that I put on my heap, I'm constantly asking myself, is this adding air? Is it adding water? Is it a mixture of the two? Is it too soft? Will I need to open it up with a bit more woody stuff? And in between my two compost bins, I've actually filled the whole space with sawdust and chippings and shavings that I get from a friend who's a furniture maker. And I fill it up there because I also run a humanure system, sort of compost toilet system. And I need it for that as well. So that any time that I'm adding stuff from my kitchen caddy, I also add a bucket full or so of the wood chip sawdust mix. So that way I'm always keeping it aerated and balanced, and it's quite tough. And because I'm a no-dig gardener, I'm not bothered about any woody chunks getting onto my soil, onto my allotment, because I'm not going to dig it in. And if it's just on the surface, you're not going to get nitrogen robbery or anything like that. So I'm quite relaxed about that. So I'm a bit of a no digger. But having said that, if you're running a food waste composting system and you're putting stuff through something like the Rye Down or the Rocket or the Big Hanna or one of these machines, then they're obviously turning it constantly and they're accelerating it through that first phase of composting. So, I used to turn my compost, and then I realized it was actually a lot of work. And I'd rather be doing the garden, frankly, than turning compost bins. So they're heavy, and I dig them out at the end and scoop the top bit off and add it to the next pile. Not a lot really. I mean, it depends what you mean by unfinished, I guess. And it depends where you're putting it. I mean, you wouldn't want to put unfinished compost around little seedlings, for instance, but if you're putting them around, good established perennial plants like your raspberries or your blackcurrant bushes or something like that, you're not going to have, it's not going to be any problem at all. In fact, I quite often do that, it'll be fine. If you've run out of space in your compost heap, I quite often do that. Or I'll, bits inevitably get in that haven't been so well composted, and I'm not sieving out all my compost or anything like that. So I don't really care what it looks like. And what you can do is, if you're piling it onto a fairly clear bit of ground and you think, oh, that looks a bit rough, you can just go over it with a rake and just rake it a bit and pull out any of the bigger twigs and sticky bits and just shove them back in the compost for another go round. So, there's various things you can do, but it's mostly aesthetic, not going to be a problem with the soil. Bakashi is not a composting system. It's an anaerobic fermentation system. So a wormery is, people go wrong with wormeries because they do get quite anaerobic, because they do tend to just add kitchen waste to it, as you're right. And the liquid that's produced from both of them is the breakdown of that high water content, food waste that you're putting in vegetable materials. As the cell walls rupture, they release the liquid, the water that comes out from both systems, and so you need to capture them. But they are different things. The liquid that comes off of the bakashi bins can actually be used to clean out drains. You can actually put some of it in your pond to clean out slime in the ponds and that kind of thing. They're quite useful. The guy Professor Higa, who kind of invented the system in Japan, there's a 2-book set that I've got, and there are bakashi clubs in Japan and the Far East, and people coming up with all kinds of, you'd think it would cure everything in the world when you read what they say that you can use bakashi liquid for. But it's what I've done with it when I've used it is actually soak paper in the bakashi liquid and then hang that up to dry, and then you've got an endless supply of your bakashi material, so you never have to buy more of the impregnated on the brand bakashi, because it costs 10-20 quid, I don't know, to buy bags of the brand that it's usually on, but you can just recycle it from your own bakashi setup. So that's what I do. Whereas the liquid that you get from a wormery, you can water that down and feed your plants with it. You know, that's well, you can feed your plants with the bakashi as well, actually, but that's what I would do with that. Yeah, I think it's important to note that if you do run a wormery, that they're the ones that the commercial wormeries are designed, they're not the best design generally, because they're vertical rather than horizontal. If you go to a worm farm, the worms are living in a layer, in a horizontal layer, not in a vertical tower. And so it's the surface area that's important for worms, and they can get very stagnant and airless. So when I was running wormeries, separate wormeries, I was adding in quite a lot of wood chip as well to open it up to let the air through a bit more, which I think is important. But basically the maturation phase of the compost is going to bring lots and lots of, it's going to get riddled with worms. So, you know, the picture that I've got there, that's actually from my Scotty Hotbox, the worms that were in that, not in a wormery. That's just in a maturation phase of a compost bin. I've not tried that. I don't like recommending things I haven't tried, but I would imagine they would just kind of hang around in there. I mean, if it was in a wormery, the worms might start attacking them. They certainly love cardboard, worms. They probably would start eating the bits of the compostable stuff, because they're usually made of potato starch or cornstarch or that kind of thing. So it is actually food for a lot of the creatures in the compost. But quite a lot of them are quite tough, because that's the problem with plastics. They have to be tough enough to do the job when they're doing their job, but then break down in the compost afterwards. So I often find that they don't really fully break down until they've come out of the compost heap at the end and then spread onto the allotment, and they get in contact with air, a lot more air and sunlight, and then they kind of shatter and break down. So you just have to experiment. I mean, the great thing about composting, I think, is that it's fun to experiment with and try things out and try different things and see if they work or not, you know, and not be bound by lots of rules, you know. Yeah, you can, although of course I haven't talked about Comfrey. Comfrey's a subject very dear to my heart, because I studied at the Henry Doubleday Research Association, and I learned how to make comfrey juice properly. And it always pains me when I hear Bob Flowerdew and Monty Don and other gardening experts telling you to plunge it into a barrel full of water, because that's the worst thing to do. You end up with a really disgustingly smelling stuff with comfrey and water. You just need to shove your comfrey into a barrel without water, with a hole at the bottom, and then a bit of plastic. I've got a bit of pond liner under my barrel, which diverts the liquid, which will run in a week or so, week to 10 days, into a smaller bucket, and then water that down to feed plants. Nettles are a little, what I tend to do with nettles is chop a few up and add them to my comfrey. They're not as juicy as the comfrey. They're more fibrous, so they don't release their juices so readily. So those I happily add to my compost. Yeah, I have thought of gathering a load of nettles and trying running over them with I've got a rotary mower, which I very rarely use actually. I was given it, but I thought, well, maybe I'll try running the nettles through that and juicing them up a bit to get a bit of liquid from them. But yeah, you can add them to your compost, no problem. Depends, when people say comfrey, though, do be careful that there are lots of different sorts of comfrey, and the comfrey that most people are talking about is the Bocking 14 Russian Comfrey, a clone of Russian Comfrey, which is a sterile hybrid. So it doesn't set seed, but the native Comfreys will seed all over the place, and you know they're more kind of, they'll get out of control if you're not careful.
Thank you very much, Nikki, for that great talk, and thank you to our virtual audience for coming along and asking these pertinent questions. And if you have further questions, well, you'll find the answers here. So I would like you, please, to lift your glasses or your mugs to congratulate Nikki on the launch of his new book. And if you are looking to buy this book, it's available from all good bookstores, and we support independent bookstores on our website. So in the meantime, cheers.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I haven't got anything to drink now, but I'll go.